It was supposed to be the proudest day of my life. Until my sister claimed my house for her kids, and my own mother told me to leave my own home. That was the moment I realized blood doesn't always mean loyalty. There are milestones in life that don't just represent achievement, they represent transformation. Not just what has been gained, but what has been endured, what has been overcome, what has been rebuilt from fragments other people never saw. Owning a home was never just a financial goal. It was a vision of safety, independence, and finally, permanence. It was a place that wouldn't be taken, questioned, or made to feel borrowed. It was a declaration that after years of surviving, something had finally been claimed. Something that belonged entirely to me. The journey to that front door began long before the down payment. It began in quiet acts of resilience. In the days when every dollar mattered. In nights when uncertainty echoed louder than hope. It began in all the times I was told I was being unrealistic, that I should settle for less, that I didn't need my own space. It began with the rejection of those limiting beliefs. It began the moment I decided I was allowed to dream without apologizing for the size of my vision. The number $960,000 was never the point. It wasn't about price tags or prestige. It was about value. The value of every sacrifice that had no audience. The value of working in silence, of saying no to things others easily said yes to, of carrying responsibilities that delayed comfort in favor of long-term stability. That house stood for every moment I had chosen the harder path. Not because I enjoyed struggle, but because I had been raised to survive, and surviving taught me how to build a future that could not be easily taken. The process was not romantic. It was filled with practical decisions, careful calculations, and delayed gratification. Every month required discipline. Every expense had to be weighed. Every moment of doubt had to be met with persistence. There were times when it felt impossible, when rising interest rates or shifting costs threatened to undo years of planning. But the vision remained steady. Because it wasn't built on fantasy, it was built on necessity. I didn't want luxury. I wanted liberation. And that kind of desire isn't driven by aesthetics, it's driven by history. The home was more than square footage. It was a space carved out of a life that had often felt unstable. It was the answer to a question I had carried for years. What does it mean to be safe on your own terms? It wasn't about living large. It was about living fully in a space untouched by expectations, unburdened by compromises that favored others. It was about walking into a place where every item, every decision, every detail was the result of my own hands. My own choices, my own freedom. The housewarming wasn't meant to be a performance. It was meant to be a moment of pause. A time to acknowledge that the finish line had finally been crossed. The chaos of paperwork, inspections, approvals, and timelines had settled. The keys were mine. The doors opened to a future I had fought for. And the idea of inviting others in was not to impress, but to celebrate, to share the space not as a trophy, but as proof that even after being doubted, dismissed, and overlooked, dreams can still materialize in drywall and tile and light pouring through clean windows. There was pride, not in the way others define it, but in the quiet way that settles deep in your chest, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt, the kind that holds 100 memories behind one single moment of calm. There was joy, not just in the aesthetic, but in the autonomy, in knowing that every room was mine, to define, that every wall could carry only what I wanted, that no corner needed to accommodate someone else's expectations, that I had created a space where my life was not just allowed, but prioritized. This fresh start didn't erase the past. It honored it. Every struggle became part of the foundation. Every setback became another reason to build with care. Every doubt became a beam of support. The home stood as a quiet rebellion against everything I had once been told I couldn't do. It stood as a reclamation of space, of voice, of choice. The decision to host a housewarming was made with a kind of nervous excitement, not because I needed validation, but because I believed in celebrating moments that once felt unreachable. It wasn't about showing off. It was about opening a door to say, look what's possible when you stop waiting to be chosen, and choose yourself instead. Look what grows when you stop shrinking to fit and start expanding in alignment with your worth. It was about acknowledging the milestone without diminishing the miles that led to it. In that moment, everything felt aligned. The furniture didn't have to be perfect. The decor didn't need to impress. The food didn't need to be catered, because the home itself was the celebration. The fact that it existed with my name on it, my design choices in it, my energy anchoring it was enough. For the first time in a long time, enoughness didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like truth. There was hope in that space. Not the fragile kind. The rooted kind. The kind that doesn't depend on approval or applause. The kind that grows from choosing to believe in your own path even when no one else walks beside you. There was healing in that space, not just from past wounds, but from the belief that healing had to be solitary. The house was a gathering place. Not for crowds, but for clarity. For laughter that didn't carry tension. For connections that didn't demand performance. It was my reset, my safe ground. My answer to every moment when I had doubted whether the effort was worth it. And in that quiet pride, in that spaciousness, in that sacred stillness, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Ownership, not just of property, but of possibility. A grounded, unshakable sense that whatever came next, I had already won the most important battle, believing that I deserved more and working until I stood inside it. There is power in creating a life you don't have to escape from. In building a space that doesn't require you to pretend. In knowing that every part of it reflects who you've become, not who others tried to make you. The walls didn't just hold memories waiting to be made, they held proof that growth is possible even when it's slow, even when it's lonely, even when it looks nothing like what others expect. This home was a love letter to the version of myself who kept going, who didn't give up, who worked in silence, who said no when it was hard, who believed that something more was possible. And standing in that space, not as someone needing to justify her success, but as someone quietly living in it felt like the softest, strongest kind of victory. Entitlement rarely announces itself. It doesn't always enter with demands or ultimatums. Often, it arrives with a smile, cloaked in familiarity, dressed in comfort. It doesn't roar. It seeps in, casual and calculated, as if claiming space is natural, as if taking is simply the next step after being welcomed. It masks itself as family, dresses itself in obligation, and hides its sharpness behind the softness of shared history. The signs of it are rarely dramatic in the beginning, but over time, they accumulate, quietly, relentlessly. Some people are raised to believe the world will adjust to them, that every room they walk into will stretch itself to meet their preferences, that others will move aside to make space, and that consideration is currency others owe them, not something they must offer in return. It is a belief learned through subtle reinforcement, where their needs are prioritized without question and their presence is never challenged. And once they carry that belief long enough, it becomes identity. It becomes expectation. It becomes the invisible rulebook by which they navigate the lives of others. She had been entitled long before the housewarming, long before adulthood, long before I learned to name what I was experiencing. It was there in the way space was always made for her, in the way her needs came first, in the way silence followed when she took more than her share. It was there in the casual assumptions, the dismissive comments, the way apologies never followed hurt. It wasn't that she asked directly, it was that she never felt the need to. The expectation was built into every interaction. The entitlement wasn't always loud. It often showed up as passive expectation, the kind that assumes your time is available, that your belongings are shared, that your accomplishments are community property, while hers are sacred and untouchable. It was woven into the fabric of family dynamics, reinforced by the silence of those who noticed but never intervened, encouraged by the small rewards she received every time she took more and faced new consequence. It was in the way she never asked if she was imposing, in the way she spoke about other space as if it were hers to critique or manage, in the way she walked through boundaries like they were merely suggestions, not lines drawn with intention. It was in her belief that anything she wanted could be justified, so long as it was framed with emotion, with family, with the language of closeness, as if blood erased limits, as if proximity guaranteed permission. Even when I achieved something, the entitlement remained. It didn't change based on my growth. It simply adjusted its expectations to match the new terrain. If I struggled, I was pitied. If I succeeded, I was expected to share, not with pride or celebration but with a quiet insistence that her comfort should expand alongside my progress. My achievements were never fully mine in her eyes. They were opportunities, resources, extensions of what she believed should be accessible to her without question. When the house became a reality, the sense of entitlement didn't wait. It appeared early in offhanded remarks about how lucky I was to have so much space, in suggestions that certain rooms would be perfect for the kids, In comments framed as compliments but laced with insinuation. It was never framed as a demand, but the implication was clear. This wasn't just my home in her mind. It was a new asset for the family ecosystem. Something to be leveraged, redistributed, reassigned. And I was expected to agree. Without pause, without resistance. It wasn't the first time she had assumed access. Over the years, there had been borrowed clothes, never returned. Borrowed money never mentioned again. Borrowed time, always taken for granted. What made this moment different was the scale. This wasn't about something replaceable. This wasn't a matter of inconvenience. This was about the most significant investment of my life, a space I had carved out not just financially, but emotionally, a place that represented freedom. A place that was finally mine. And yet, she moved through it like it was already familiar. Like it was a given. Like being family automatically made her a stakeholder in my autonomy. There were no questions, only suggestions. No acknowledgments, only assumptions. Her presence felt less like a guest and more like a quiet inspection, as if she was already deciding how it could serve her, where her family could fit, what use could be made of what I had built. The entitlement was generational, learned, inherited, enabled. It came not just from her, but from the way others responded to her, the way boundaries were always negotiated down, the way consequences were always softened, the way every overstep was explained away as stress or motherhood or personality. She had learned that she could reach and receive, take and be forgiven, expect and never ask. And no one had ever shown her differently. There's a kind of exhaustion that comes from managing someone else's assumptions. From always having to be the one who clarifies, defends, reasserts. From constantly being expected to bend, accommodate, surrender. It is an exhaustion that doesn't come all at once, but builds over time. Until even small requests feel heavy. Until even simple conversations feel like negotiations. Until your own space begins to feel like a stage, where someone else keeps rewriting your lines. She didn't see the house as mine, not truly. She saw it as a symbol, a structure she could enter and claim by proximity, a space she believed could be adapted to her needs without disrupting the narrative of support, of family, of shared success. But what she didn't understand was that entitlement doesn't shrink in the face of love, it grows, especially when it's unchallenged. And what she saw as closeness, I now saw as consumption. There was no moment of self-awareness. No pause where she considered whether her comments were invasive. No recognition of the years it had taken me to reach that point. In her mind, everything I had was fair game, because I had more than I needed, because she had children, because we were family, because generosity, when expected, becomes a moral obligation twisted to serve the one who feels owed. The worst kind of entitlement is the one that's emotional, the kind that paints you as selfish if you say no. That frames your boundaries as rejection. That uses guilt as leverage. That turns your mind into ours without consent. It doesn't knock. It just walks in. And when you speak up, it pretends to be wounded. It shifts blame. It rewrites the story so that you become the villain for simply protecting what you've earned. That was the tone under her presence at the housewarming. Not celebration, but survey. Not joy, but quiet judgment. Her words were dipped in sweetness, but her eyes moved like someone measuring, noticing, calculating. Her voice spoke of family, but her posture carried expectation. She wasn't impressed, she was entitled. And she believed that being impressed was unnecessary when she already saw herself as having partial ownership by virtue of relation. It wasn't just her, it was the silence around her. The people who said nothing, who heard her suggestions and smiled politely, who let her ideas float in the air unchallenged, who watched her inch closer and said nothing. The entitlement became heavier in the silence. It grew with every nod, every non-reaction, every deflection, and in that quiet agreement, I realized just how long I had been expected to accommodate. There's a deep cost to constantly being the one who bends, the one who shares, the one who's good in a way that means sacrificing comfort to avoid conflict. And in that space, as I watched my own hard-won achievement slowly being treated like a shared resource, I felt that cost rising again. Not in anger, but in clarity. I was no longer in the position to shrink. Not this time, not here, not in the one place that had finally been mine. Asterisk, there is a unique kind of disbelief that sets in when someone crosses a line you never imagined needed to be drawn. Some boundaries feel so self-evident, so fundamental, that you never think to reinforce them. The idea that your home, your most personal, hard-earned space, could be spoken for by someone else without your permission feels too absurd to anticipate. But entitlement doesn't respect logic. It doesn't pause for reflection. It moves forward under the assumption that what's yours can become theirs if they decide they deserve it more. When entitlement evolves into ownership, the shift is rarely loud. It happens in the small moments when people begin speaking about your life as if it's an open conversation, not a closed door. It happens when your decisions are reimagined as resources. When the work behind your milestones is dismissed in favor of someone else's need. It doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with a sentence, a casual remark, a suggestion made in front of others, not for discussion, but for positioning. The moment the claim was made, it wasn't just the words that struck, it was the tone, the ease, the absolute comfort with which she declared something that wasn't hers, the casual authority that assumed no permission was needed, that the statement itself was enough to begin restructuring a reality I had built with years of effort. There was no pause to consider what that home meant. No acknowledgement of the struggle behind it. Just the unshaken belief that her situation, her role, her motherhood, her children gave her inherent access to my space. The words didn't ask, they stated. And in that moment, something shifted permanently. Not just between us, but within me. Because hearing someone else decide what should happen to your life's work forces you to reckon with every moment you've let someone minimize your worth. It brings every quiet act of dismissal into focus. Every time you allowed a line to blur in the name of peace. Every moment when you absorbed discomfort just to keep relationships intact. The claim wasn't just about the house. It was about the years leading up to it. It was the culmination of all the ways I had been expected to surrender. What made it worse was the setting. The presence of others. The way the air shifted, not with shock, but with expectation. As if this wasn't inappropriate, but familiar. As if this dynamic had been rehearsed many times before in smaller ways. The assumption wasn't isolated to her. It lived in the eyes of the people who didn't speak up. In the quiet nods. In the sidelong glances. In the way no one stopped her. No one asked if I was okay. No one even blinked at the audacity of what had just been said. The heaviest silence came from the place I least expected it, my mother. The one person I thought might feel the weight of what had just happened. The one person I thought might remember the years I had spent sacrificing, saving, striving, not for praise, but for independence. The one person I had hoped would speak up, not because I needed protection, but because I deserved acknowledgement. But the silence didn't come from shock, it came from agreement. Not with words, but with posture. With energy, with unspoken alliance. The betrayal wasn't just in the claim, it was in the approval. The way the suggestion was validated without hesitation. The way the conversation pivoted around the idea of what I could give, rather than what had been taken. There was no recognition of what it meant to be asked to leave my own home. No consideration of how deeply that cut. No understanding of how absurd and cruel it was to suggest that my success be immediately redistributed, simply because someone else was louder, needier, or more emotionally persuasive. Being told to step aside in your own space is not just a rejection, it is an erasure. It says, you may have built this, but your right to keep it is conditional. It suggests that your role is to acquire, not to enjoy. To provide, not to inhabit. It reduces you to a resource, not a person. And it reinforces the message that no matter how far you come, your success must always be available for others to lay claim to, even if they never contributed to it. Even if they never believed in it. Even if they never respected you before it existed. There was a deep, cold clarity in that moment. The kind that doesn't leave room for doubt. The kind that strips away all illusions. The kind that makes it impossible to go back to how things were before. The kind that removes not just trust, but hope, the hope that one day, things might be different, that boundaries might be respected, that effort might finally earn peace. There was no shouting, no dramatic reaction, just stillness. A stillness that held years of accumulated pain, a stillness that revealed how transactional love can become when people are too comfortable using your compassion as currency. A stillness that exposed how easily generosity is reinterpreted as obligation. A stillness that felt like standing in a house made of glass, watching the people you invited in pick up stones without hesitation. The claim that was made wasn't just about space, it was about identity. It was a demand that I diminish myself to make others comfortable. That I erase my voice to avoid disrupting the narrative of family unity. That I sacrifice my peace to uphold someone else's image of what closeness should look like. But proximity is not connection. Blood is not loyalty. And silence is not love. There is a specific grief that comes from realizing your value has always been tied to your usefulness. When you understand that what you create is admired only until it's needed. When you see clearly that the people who celebrate your growth are often the same ones who feel entitled to its fruits. When you realize that your success has not freed you, it has made you a more appealing target. The emotional dissonance was overwhelming. To be in a place that represented everything I had fought for, and to feel so unwanted in it. To feel like a visitor in my own sanctuary. To hear my own family discuss the logistics of my displacement as if it were a practical adjustment, not a violent betrayal. There was no empathy, only logistics. No conversation, only conclusions. No permission, only assumption. In that moment, something inside me closed. Not in anger, but in finality. It was the quiet ending of a role I had played for too long. The provider, the peacekeeper, the quiet one, the one who doesn't complain, the one who always gives, the one who stays soft, even when she is being broken open. That version of me had no place in this house anymore. This home was not built to house old expectations. It was built to protect the new truth. I am allowed to choose myself. The breaking point was not a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. The claim that was meant to reduce me became the moment that expanded me. It made everything sharp. It brought every dynamic into focus. It clarified every relationship. It reminded me that being available is not the same as being valued. That being family is not a license to rewrite someone else's story. That loving someone does not require allowing them to take from you endlessly. What was asked of me that day was not generosity, it was erasure. And what I chose, from that moment forward, was not bitterness, it was protection. Protection of my peace. Protection of my space. Protection of the version of me that had worked too hard to be reduced to a footnote in someone else's demand. The house may have been a physical space, but it became something more, a boundary, a line, a final refusal to be rewritten. Asterisk, asterisk, there are moments when silence becomes louder than any argument, when nothing more needs to be said, because the meaning has already settled like dust that refuses to be swept away. The breaking point does not always arrive in fury or final words. Sometimes it arrives quietly, when exhaustion meets clarity. It creeps in slowly, disguised as stillness, but underneath it is something far more permanent, a decision that will not be undone. Breaking points are rarely singular. They are the culmination of smaller fractious years of making room for others while shrinking yourself. Years of staying quiet to maintain peace, years of justifying others' behavior while ignoring your own bruises. They don't erupt out of nowhere. They build quietly in the background until the moment comes when you can no longer pretend not to feel the weight. And in that moment, you stop bending. Not because you're angry, but because you simply can't anymore. The realization isn't immediate. It's not a sudden flash of insight. It is a slow unraveling. A dismantling of every false belief you've held to keep things intact. You begin to see how much of your energy has gone into preservation of relationships, of illusions, of family ties that only remain strong when you're the one holding them together. You start to understand how much effort you've poured into being agreeable, helpful, useful. How often you've let your own needs sit untouched, while others reached for what was never theirs. At the breaking point, you stop pretending that it doesn't hurt. You stop convincing yourself that your boundaries were unclear. You stop giving people the benefit of doubt when the patterns have been repeated so many times that doubt is no longer honest, it's denial. The breaking point strips away the kindness you extended too far. Not because you want to be cruel, but because you finally realized that survival is not the same as peace. There is a kind of emotional fatigue that settles in after betrayal. It doesn't come from the betrayal itself, but from everything that led to it. From all the justifications you made. From all the times you chose silence instead of confrontation. From all the years you believed that if you just gave a little more, things would be different, but they weren't. And in that moment, you finally see that they never will be, not because you're not enough, but because some people are committed to misunderstanding you, if it serves their comfort. You stop negotiating with people who view your life as something they can rearrange. You stop explaining your decisions to those who have never cared to understand them. You stop expecting people to protect your boundaries when they benefit from crossing them. You no longer find comfort in loyalty that demands self-abandonment. You stop mistaking tolerance for love. You stop mistaking closeness for care. You stop mistaking family for safety. At the breaking point, grief changes shape. It stops being soft. It becomes sharp. It no longer asks for healing. It demands action. You begin to look at everything through new eyes. Not with anger, but with precision. You recognize patterns you once dismissed as coincidence. You see how your silence was used as a strategy. How your compassion was manipulated into compliance. How your kindness became currency others spent on themselves. You begin to grieve not just the betrayal, but the time you spent trying to prevent it. The energy wasted on people who were never interested in sharing the weight. The hope that things would get better? The belief that if you just held on a little longer, you'd be rewarded with reciprocity. You mourn the years of overfunctioning, overcompromising, overextending. The time spent trying to earn peace in places that only offered conditional acceptance, and in that mourning, something else begins to rise. Not revenge, not resentment, but resolve. You stop seeking resolution in others. You stop needing closure from those who never offered clarity. You stop asking for apologies you know will never come. The apology becomes irrelevant. The explanation loses power. The dynamic becomes a chapter that no longer needs to be read. What matters now is preservation of your time, your energy, your identity. The breaking point teaches you that not all relationships are meant to be salvaged. Some are meant to be outgrown. Some are meant to show you who you are no longer willing to be. You stop trying to build bridges to people who set fire to the other side. You stop offering softness to those who treat it as weakness. You stop walking into conversations that begin with guilt and end in silence. You stop giving explanations where boundaries are required. You don't need to shout. You don't need to prove anything. The clarity is loud enough. It radiates in your posture, your decisions, your absence. The breaking point becomes a filter. Anything not aligned with peace, truth, or respect is left behind. You no longer accept less than you offer. You no longer pretend your discomfort is temporary when it's been constant. You no longer internalize rejection as your responsibility. You learn that detachment is not cruelty, it's clarity. This clarity brings grief, yes, but also freedom. You realize that freedom isn't always found in escape. Sometimes it's found in staying and choosing differently. In no longer performing. In no longer softening the truth for others to digest. In no longer carrying the emotional labor of entire relationships on your back. You begin to live without fear of being misunderstood, because the cost of constant explanation is too high. You start to define peace on your own terms, not as the absence of conflict, but as the presence of not as the avoidance of discomfort, but as the decision to no longer abandon yourself for anyone else's comfort. You recognize that your value is not dependent on how easy you are to be around, that your strength is not in how much you endure, but in how willing you are to protect your space when it matters most. The breaking point makes you dangerous to systems that relied on your silence. Two people who were used to your compliance. Two dynamics that survived on your guilt. Not because you've become aggressive, but because you've become untouchable. You are no longer available for conversations that question your worth. You are no longer accessible to people who only show up when they need something. You are no longer interested in proving your heart to those who measured it by how much they could take. The version of you that lived for validation begins to dissolve. In its place rises someone who lives for alignment. You begin to move differently, to speak differently, to breathe differently. You no longer flinch at distance. You no longer chase closeness that costs too much. You no longer wait for the people who hurt you to understand what they've done. You begin to build a life that requires no explanation. A life that honors your effort, your boundaries, your evolution. The breaking point does not make you bitter. It makes you sovereign. You stop apologizing for needing what you need. You stop dimming your light to soothe someone else's insecurities. You stop holding space for people who don't know how to sit in it with grace. You stop carrying stories that were never yours. You release identities you adopted just to be included. You walk away from dynamics where love is earned through exhaustion. You begin to love differently too. You seek reciprocity, not obligation. You look for presence, not performance. You build with people who understand that real love doesn't demand sacrifice, it nurtures growth. You connect with those who make space, who ask questions, who listen without preparing their defense. You learn that true safety isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of care, of accountability, of mutual respect. And above all, you come home to yourself, the version of you that was buried beneath obligation, erased by guilt, stretched thin by expectation. You reclaim that version. You sit with her, you honor her. You forgive her for how long she stayed. And then you build a life that never requires her to break again. That is the real breaking point, not the end, but the beginning. Not the collapse, but the awakening. Not the betrayal, but the boundary. It is not about shutting down. It is about choosing. Choosing to stay whole. Choosing to stay soft, but no longer small. Choosing to stay kind, but no longer compliant. Choosing to stay open, but no longer accessible to those who only understand love through possession. The breaking point is not destruction, it is construction. Of a self that no longer contorts for belonging. Of a heart that no longer shrinks for approval. Of a mind that no longer spirals over someone else's lack of understanding. It is the beginning of a life that reflects the truth of who you are, not who they need you to be. ****** Reclaiming is not about confrontation. It's not about spectacle or revenge. Reclaiming is quiet. It's deliberate. It's the slow, firm act of removing other people's fingerprints from your sense of self. It is not a declaration to them, it's a commitment to yourself. It's when you look at everything they tried to define for you, and without noise or warning, begin rewriting every part of it with your own truth. To reclaim space is not simply to exist within it, it is to own it, fully, without flinching, without apology, without leaving room for old stories to breathe through the cracks. It is to stand firmly in what you built, not as a place to survive in, but as a home to live in freely. It is to say, this belongs to me, not just the walls and the roof, but the air, the light, the energy, the silence that now holds peace instead of tension. Rewriting the story begins with clarity. Clarity that no one else's voice gets to narrate your life anymore. Clarity that you don't owe anyone access simply because they knew you before you knew yourself. Clarity that you are not selfish for keeping what you worked for. Clarity that you do not need to play a role just because others are uncomfortable with your refusal to conform. The script is no longer theirs to write. The story is no longer filtered through guilt. For so long, identity had been shaped in response to others, to their needs, their expectations, their entitlement. Boundaries had been drawn in sand, easily brushed away when emotions ran high. Needs had been postponed, erased, repressed, all in the name of love, all in the name of family, all in the hope of harmony. But that harmony had never been mutual. It was built on one person's silence and another's satisfaction. Reclaiming meant redrawing the map. Not with explanations, but with decisions. Not with apologies, but with distance. It meant recognizing that access is not a birthright. That presence must be earned with respect. That the idea of being there for each other cannot be one-sided. It meant acknowledging that you are allowed to choose who gets to stay in your life, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. The process is not sudden. It is subtle. It starts in the way you no longer soften your tone to sound palatable. It continues in the way you stop over-explaining when you say no. It takes root in the way you walk through your home without flinching, without accommodating someone else's imagined claim over your space. Every act of refusal becomes an act of affirmation. Every silence becomes a boundary held. Rewriting the story also means telling the truth, not to others, but to yourself. The truth that it was never your job to sacrifice your joy for the comfort of those who refused to grow. The truth that survival was not the goal, thriving was. The truth that your worth was never dependent on how useful you were to people who only showed up when they needed something. The truth that love without respect is not love, only possession. The narrative shifts when you stop needing their understanding, when you no longer wait for them to see your side, to acknowledge your pain, to admit they're wrong. When you stop hoping they'll say the words that never come. You begin to live like someone who is no longer waiting for permission. You stop performing. You stop shrinking. You stop negotiating the terms of your existence. Reclaiming your space means taking up space unapologetically. In your home, in your choices, in your voice, in your energy. You no longer allow guilt to decorate your rooms. You no longer allow unspoken rules to dictate where you can be soft, where you must be silent. You arrange your space according to your peace. You invite only those who bring presence, not pressure. The freedom that follows is quiet. It doesn't need to be announced. It shows up in the stillness that feels safe. In the absence of surveillance. In the lack of second guessing. It shows up in the way you breathe deeper. In the way your body relaxes when you're alone. In the way your mind no longer rehearses defenses. Freedom lives in the unspoken knowing that you are no longer responsible for holding everything together at your own expense. Rewriting. The story is also about healing the part of you that believed overgiving was love. That compliance was connection. That being chosen meant being used. You begin to untangle love from sacrifice. You begin to understand that real love doesn't demand erasure. It doesn't consume. It doesn't expect you to disappear for the sake of appearances. Real love makes room. It honors your voice. It holds space for your no. Reclaiming is also choosing your own standards. For how you are spoken to. For how your time is valued. For how your home is treated. For how your presence is respected. It is deciding, again and again, to stay true to those standards, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it's lonely. Even when others call you difficult for refusing to make yourself smaller. The story you now write is not reactive. It is intentional. You are no longer sculpted by other people's preferences. You are shaped by your own truth, by your own values, by your own clarity. You become someone who lives in alignment, not obligation. Someone who moves through life with rootedness, not performance. Someone who protects their energy like it matters because it does. And in that new story, you find peace. Not the fragile kind that breaks under pressure, but the anchored kind that cannot be shaken. Peace that doesn't depend on how others treat you, but on how you treat yourself. Peace that doesn't require withdrawal, but discernment. Peace that comes from no longer making yourself available to people who refuse to meet you with mutuality. There is power in reclaiming, not because it changes others, but because it changes you. It reminds you that you have always been enough, even when others failed to see it. That your dreams were never too much, even when others told you to settle. That your boundaries are sacred, even when others try to cross them in the name of love. The rewritten story becomes a legacy, not of perfection, but of authenticity. You begin to teach others, not through lectures, but through your example, what it means to live in self-respect. What it means to honor your own timeline. What it means to choose yourself without turning cold. What it means to love deeply, but also wisely. Reclaiming is not about control. It's about sovereignty. About living a life that no longer hinges on how well you're received. It's about walking into your home and feeling safe. Not surveilled, about celebrating your success without being asked to give it away. About owning your narrative fully, the struggle, the silence, the shift, the strength. And in this new version of your story, you are not a supporting character. You are not the peacekeeper. You are not the background, you are the center. You are the voice. You are the builder. You are the keeper of your own peace. You are the one who defines what is allowed, what is welcomed, what is sacred. What you reclaimed wasn't just a house. It was your agency, your voice, your right to stay in spaces you earned. Your ability to say no without explanation. Your strengths to end cycles without apology. Your freedom to rewrite the story, not with bitterness, but with unshakable grace. This is the new story. And this time, it belongs entirely to you.